Yes, guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to this afternoon's live stream. And as always with Chelsea, there's plenty going on. We've got a packed show for you. Latest on Marc Cucurella signing from Brighton potentially. We've got all the latest on Wesley Fofana, interest in Frankie de Jong, and much, much more. And as always, I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Jacobs. Ben, thanks for your time as always, mate. Let's get straight into it. Was expecting news fast last week. After the Koundé debacle, there wasn't really a lot. It was a bit of a quiet week. And then suddenly over the weekend and yesterday, things seem to have exploded into life. Chelsea seem to have potentially jumped the queue on Manchester City in the potential signing of Marc Cucurella, the left centre-back, left wing-back option from Brighton. City obviously were in pole position, not prepared to go over £40 million. Brighton wanting 50. Obviously, Cucurella was more than happy to go to City, but they're not going to increase their bid, supposedly. And Chelsea kind of jumped into the driving seat here. We've obviously got personal terms all agreed, as widely reported this morning, just a fee to sort out. So, Ben, on this Cucurella deal, how close do you think this is? And Chelsea, obviously, they're going to stump up the £50 million?
Well, as of last night, it was very close, just a case of agreeing a fee between the clubs. As you say, Cucurella happy to sign personal terms with Chelsea, and Manchester City haven't come back in as yet. Now, as I reported yesterday, City had extended talks with Cucurella and were at the same time looking at Borna Sosa, a Croatian left-back, as a backup and a cheaper option. And when Chelsea approached Brighton, Manchester City didn't respond. So it's a clear path at the moment from Chelsea's perspective, and things are very advanced. There is always that niggling doubt that Cucurella has handed in a transfer request and wants the Manchester City move, and that has been made very clear over the course of the last few weeks before Chelsea entered the race, that his absolute dream was to play for Pep Guardiola. But City sources remain adamant that they're not going to come back in at this stage. And I think if they were to up their bid and get it closer to somewhere around 50 million, they would have to have moved in the past 24 hours because Chelsea are getting closer and closer. And Cucurella absolutely open to playing at Chelsea. From Thomas Tuchel's perspective, it's the versatility. I know some fans will say we need defenders, but we're pretty well covered in the left-back position, but he can also play on the left side of central defence, and I think in the short term that is really the appeal. Ben Chilwell will remain the number one left back because of the form that he's in. He's absolutely integral to Thomas Tuchel's plans, but Cucurella provides that versatility and defensive cover that Chelsea need, and it's a fantastic bit of business if it comes off. Some would argue that Chelsea are paying a little bit over the odds, which is obviously Manchester City's perspective as well. But the reality is, from Brighton's point of view, he's only been there a year. He's had some injury problems during that time. They paid 15 million. So if they get the best part of 50 million, that's good business for them. And Chelsea get in another defensive reinforcement. So it makes a fair amount of sense in the short term as a centre-back, in the long term as left-back cover, and that ability to move across either a back three or a back four. And let's not forget that Thomas Tuchel may end up playing both across this season. So the situation now, and it will change in a matter of hours, or certainly the next 48 hours, is that Chelsea are hopeful of finalising a fee. And if they do that, everything is in place to complete the deal. If they hit the number Brighton are looking for, believed to be close to £50 million, and maybe even slightly higher with add-ons included as well, then at that point it all comes down to the player. And given he's intimated he's open to the Chelsea move rather than waiting and holding out for Manchester City, and he's been given no indication that Manchester City will even return to this bid, everything is pointing towards Chelsea getting in another signing, and relatively quickly. And again, more evidence that Todd Boehly has moved fast on behalf of Thomas Tuchel.
Yeah, I think this is one that definitely excites myself and a lot of other Chelsea fans. As you say, the versatility there. Again, we were linked with Nathan Ake earlier in the window. There was interest there, but I probably view Cucurella as 3 years younger, I think, at 24. And he's got that same versatility, so probably much better than Ake in that left wing-back slot. I think this is a better piece of business for Chelsea than Nathan Ake would be. Obviously, as you just said, hopefully Manchester City don't come back in. As Chelsea have had a few traumatic moments of thinking we've got players and then other clubs come in and nick them. So hopefully City don't come back in for him. But just on the deal itself, I've seen some reports that suggest that Levi Colwill could be involved in this deal. Brighton have got a long-term interest, I believe, in him. I've seen things saying that any deal for Colwill would be entirely separate. Is that what you understand as well? This is going to be straight cash, and any Colwill deal would be done separately if that was to happen.
It's looking that way. I think when you have suitors after Cucurella in Manchester City, historically, at the moment anyway, and Chelsea, the Brighton perspective, as I understand it, is a straight cash deal, but they do have an interest in Levi Colwill. From Chelsea's perspective, I still don't think that they have clarified what they want to do with the player. So if you're Brighton, you might be saying, give us X amount of money and Levi Colwill on top. But Chelsea, I still think, would prefer a loan deal and to keep these two players separate. And then, of course, they have the ability to control Colwill's future and bring him back to the football club in a year's time. And it would be a good step up for him if anything materialises. But Brighton's long-standing interest in Colwill has been with a view to getting a permanent signing. So that's important to point out. And Colwill has been asking for clarity as to who's going to be coming in defensively, because that influences, a bit like Broja, whether or not he wants to leave the club or is prepared to be loaned out again. With Broja, of course, he went on loan to Vitesse, then Southampton, and having played in the Premier League and scored 6 goals, it makes more sense that he's forcing a permanent exit if he's given no guarantees of his game time across the season, whereas Colwill played at Huddersfield, so then Premier League for a year on loan is very much a step up. But there's quite a bit of finesse around any negotiations for Colwill, which is why I think that Chelsea would prefer to keep things separate and get in a player first and then continue talks with Brighton and Hove Albion. Because again, coming back to what I said before, Brighton would prefer this ability to have a loan deal and then maybe force a option to buy, whereas Chelsea, again, I think if the player buys in, and that's the key question, would be more inclined to say, have him for a year, then he's ours, because they simply don't know where they'll stand defensively at that point. And what I think benefits Colwill at Chelsea is that if you look at 2 centre-backs in particular in Koulibaly and Silva, they're not young. So they're exactly what Chelsea need right now. But if you're Colwill, you're saying in 2 seasons or so, there's a fair chance that both of them get either phased out or used in more of a squad role. And then he will hope, if he proves himself in the Premier League on a loan, he can come back to Chelsea and be far more integral. And if those guarantees are given, I think there'll be buy-in from Chelsea and the player that it's loan only. But it's complicated because obviously a loan deal doesn't benefit Brighton if it is only a loan deal beyond 12 months. And Southampton found that with Broja, that he was great and they are going to struggle, I think, for goals. And now they can't get the player back. And Chelsea have already rejected a permanent deal from West Ham for the player. So it just shows you that a loan is a band-aid. And that is why so many clubs, when they try and negotiate, either through these type of swap deals, which have been hypothetically touted, or with an option to buy, push for that. So it's quite an interesting conversation. I think most people think a loan is just like, it benefits a young player, it benefits the club that want the player on loan, done deal. But increasingly, it's more complex, the negotiations, for the reasons that I've just outlined. But I think with Cucurella, it's far more likely just to be a straight cash deal, and then Chelsea and Brighton can continue conversations afterwards surrounding Levi Colwill.
Yeah, no, I'm hoping, hopefully, that Cucurella can be done before the Premier League season starts, maybe make his debut against Everton. I don't know how quickly and how likely that is to be, but yeah, looking promising. And with Colwill, I think, again, if Chelsea are going to do any deal, I think it's integral that there's a buyback clause in there, whether it's active after 1 or 2 years or whatever it is, because we've been stung in the past with the likes of Marc Guehi, Tomori, etc. We don't want to have another issue like that where we sell someone, no buyback clause, and they go on to become a top player. We don't want to revisit that. But yeah, Cucurella, that's promising. Looks like it's could be imminent in the next few days, hopefully. But Ben, one that's probably a little bit hard for you at the moment, being a Leicester City fan, the future of Wesley Fofana. It's kind of one, Chelsea again have had long-term interest in Fofana. Leicester, Brendan Rodgers adamant that he's not for sale. Obviously had a bad injury most of last season, ruled him out of that leg break. Came back, played at the back end of last season, actually signed an extended long-term contract in March. Very much, the ball is firmly, Leicester hold all the guards here. They're not, they don't really need to sell him. And, he's got the years on his contract. That means they can command a high fee. 75 million pounds. I'm seeing potential for players to be involved. Latest report was Ruben Loftus-Cheek maybe heading in the other direction, although there's a article from Matt Law stating that Loftus-Cheek is not particularly interested in leaving Chelsea. We've had the sort of the hoo-ha of Fofana's taken Leicester City out of his bio on social media and all this. It's clear that Fofana definitely fancies a move, but Leicester, with obviously Newcastle sniffing around James Maddison as well, they've lost Kasper Schmeichel to Nice. I can't see them getting rid of Maddison and Fofana both this summer. So it's obviously going to be one or the other. This Fofana deal is complicated for a number of reasons. How likely do you think it is that Fofana could sign for Chelsea? And do you think, how likely is it that going to happen? And what sort of complications are there?
Lots of complications. And I think I would go even further as to say that there's no guarantees that either Fofana or Maddison will be sold this summer. But a big offer for one or the other could well tempt Leicester City. So Leicester's perspective is basically that they're expecting an offer for Youri Tielemans, and then that fee, if/when they finally get it, will give them a little bit more flexibility in the market. And Leicester will let Tielemans go because of his contract situation. And then from a list of 3, there could, but not definitively will be, one more outgoing from Fofana, Maddison, and some say Harvey Barnes, with Newcastle interested as well. But from Brendan Rodgers' perspective, he doesn't want to let any of these players go. And Leicester would even like Tielemans to sign a contract extension. That's looking very unlikely because the player wants to leave and Arsenal still may come in for him. But with Wesley Fofana, it's simple in many respects, in the sense that Chelsea are going to make zero progress on Fofana unless they table a massive offer, a Harry Maguire style offer. And Leicester can hold out for that or just keep on to the player, regardless of what he does on social media, simply because he signed a new contract in March. And as I understand it, when Fofana signed that contract in March, he was told by the club that they would listen to fair and reasonable offers in 2023. So there's an element from Fofana's perspective, unfortunately, of having his cake and eating it, because if he signs a contract in March and is given that guarantee, then this summer to try and force an exit becomes very difficult. And he's got a good relationship with Brendan Rodgers, and he's not usually the type of character that would kind of throw his toys out the pram, hand in a transfer request and so on. He's pretty humble. He's much more like an N'Golo Kante in how he conducts himself at the training ground and off the football field. But what we're seeing on social media is gamesmanship and clear hints that he would like to move to Chelsea. Everybody's seen the photo of a young Fofana in a Chelsea shirt. Everybody has now noted that he's removed the words Leicester City from his bios on Twitter and Instagram. But at the same time, he liked a post that said, Leicester City say Fofana is not for sale. And he's also just posted another photo on his Instagram story of him playing football in a Leicester City shirt. So there is an element of gamesmanship and hinting at his desire to leave. And Chelsea have always looked at Fofana for really the last 2 windows, but with a view to the future rather than imminently. And they've then had to escalate this interest in Fofana due to the urgent need to bring in a centre-back. And I think that Chelsea didn't move earlier on Fofana in their rankings simply because they thought at the beginning of the window he was completely untouchable. And now they're trying their luck. So what we know is that Fofana is totally open to the move if a fee was agreed, but won't actively, despite what you see on social media, force his way out of Leicester City face to face, if you like, with Brendan Rodgers. I don't see him handing in a transfer request, and it would be very difficult for Leicester to accept that, considering, as I say, he signed a new contract, and he will have known when he signed that new contract that that was the risk in 2022 and the January transfer window. Very difficult for him to leave. So there is a commitment there to Leicester City, but this Chelsea interest has, I think, caught Fofana by surprise because he was anticipating something next summer. And now he's got one eye on Champions League football and the World Cup. And it makes a lot of sense. That's the honest truth. But Leicester have all of the control. So Chelsea will have to pay above market value. I don't think it will be 70 or 75 million. As I reported a month ago, that is the minimum amount to even get Leicester at the table. Otherwise, it's an out of hand instant dismissal, as we've seen Leicester dismiss a 40 million odd bid by Newcastle United for James Maddison. to actually land him, it's probably closer to 80 or 85 million. And let's see whether Chelsea pay that. The club's initial valuation saw them around 20 million apart. Chelsea are prepared to go up. And again, with Bowley, it probably is the case that he would like to offset some of that cost with a swap deal. But my understanding is that there's nothing in the Ruben Loftus-Cheek links that hasn't been offered. Chelsea are going to keep him, and Leicester are not especially interested either in Ruben Loftus-Cheek from what I'm told, and therefore doing a swap deal can be problematic. And it's funny because we've just spoken about Brighton coming back in potentially for Levi Colwill. That's another player that Leicester are, loosely speaking, interested in. But if you're Leicester City, you're basically saying sell now and we want cash. So a swap deal, I think, is also very problematic in this whole saga, simply because Leicester have got so much control that, yeah, they need players and replacements. But if they're not the perfect fit, if they're not Brendan Rodgers' number one target, then at that point, Leicester are just going to take a ton of cash and say, as they've always done on a recruitment level, we back ourselves to find another hidden gem at that 10 to 15 million mark. And then if you've got 85 million, then you find yourself with 70 million odd profit, and you buy the replacement, and then the replacement either turns into another Fofana, or you get the opportunity to cash in on them over time and they grow into another 70 million quid player. And Leicester are very good at that. They did it with Kante. They brought Chilwell through, and now Fofana is another player that has grown from cheap to almost astronomical in terms of his fee. So Chelsea are basically just going to have to table a big offer. And then at that point, Leicester's resolve will be tested. Are they going to, as with Maguire, accept something around the 80, 85 million mark and change their strategy and stance of not for sale? Or will they just stick to their guns? And at the moment, I think the answer to that is 50-50. It's important to note as well that Chelsea have made contact. There are talks scheduled for this week. They have not made any kind of formal offer yet. The back and forth has seen them completely apart in valuation. But what we will see next, which is really important, and I think that this is key with Maddison as well, is how Leicester respond. Because if Leicester turn around to Chelsea and say, even if you offer 100 million, the answer is no, then we're in Declan Rice territory and Chelsea should move on. But if Leicester say, sure, table a bid and then we'll assess it, then that kind of opens the door to imply that they might be willing to negotiate. And as soon as Chelsea get intimation that Leicester will at least seriously listen to a reasonable offer, at that point, it becomes more and more likely that if the clubs agree a fee, then Fofana will be sold this window, despite the fact that Brendan Rodgers says that he's not for sale. So it's one to watch over the next few days. I think Chelsea want to move fast on this, much like with Cucurella. And I don't see this one dragging on throughout the window. I think Chelsea want clarity, and if they think Fofana is viable, they will try and get things done before the season starts, and if they don't, they'll walk away.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I'm hoping that potentially a bid maybe go in once the Cucurella deal's wrapped up. We might see a bid maybe towards the end of this week. I mean, that would certainly be interesting. But in terms of other centre-back targets, Ben, obviously if Fofana proves unattainable, obviously Cucurella comes in, hopefully, obviously more of a left wing-back, but as we've seen, can play left centre-back. I think Kimpembe is probably off the table now. I mean, are the likes of Milan Skriniar, is that still on the table? Gvardiol, Chelsea still interested in, but that's going to be very hard to prize him out of Leipzig. I mean, are there any other players other than those two that, if Chelsea don't get Fofana in, I mean, what other options are there really?
Well, I mean, options always materialise.
Yeah.
And when you start the season, then there's a lull because everyone wants to see how they start and then assess between options. And then, of course, as we get 2 weeks, let's say, before the window closes, there's more of a merry-go-round of movement. And that's when you start to see targets that you either didn't think were available, or somebody brings in a new signing, and then a player that you wanted and were told no on suddenly becomes a yes. And this is the kind of finesse and the unpredictability of the transfer window, particularly as it gets closer. And there shouldn't be a panic really at this stage from any club, but obviously from Chelsea's perspective under new owners, because there's been so many outgoings and they've got a fair few players that still want to leave, like Azpilicueta and Lonzo and Werner. There is that urgency to find first and then resolve the outgoings. And that has kind of left Chelsea very busy both with incomings and outcomings really consistently throughout the window. And I don't see that changing until it shuts. So it wouldn't remotely surprise me if the day after the transfer window closes, Todd Boehly and Thomas Tuchel just take about 24 hours of constant sleep, because they're both exhausted, and Tuchel wants the added responsibility and pressure, but it's also quite difficult to balance, and it would be for any manager. And from Boehly's perspective, he's obviously an interim sporting director, a minority owner. He's new to Chelsea. He's lost a few members of staff that are kind of still only there on an advisory capacity, and he's chairman of the football club as well. So it's a lot to juggle and balance. And a transfer window, even to a standard sporting director with years of experience, is thoroughly exhausting and frustrating and stressful. So you can imagine what Boehly is going through. And I think that he does actually deserve credit for how he's handling this. It's very easy to say that Chelsea are just missing out on targets, but he's being decisive, he's being bold, he's putting his money where his mouth is on behalf of the new ownership group. And at the same time, he's in a series of new roles at a new club. And I think that he is doing actually really well to have first brought in Sterling and Koulibaly. If Cucurella is added as well, and then Fofana came, then Chelsea fans are suddenly incredibly excited by what will be an ambitious window, when 2 weeks ago it was doom and gloom and panic and Chelsea are somehow going to finish fifth. And I think that's why everybody really just needs to get their own good night's sleep and take a breath and judge this ownership group come game one and then come the end of the transfer window, and just be a little bit more patient. Other centre-back targets, Skriniar is still a possibility, and Dumfries too. It's been quite hard to negotiate with Inter. These were names that were discussed when Lukaku was possibly going to be a permanent deal, and Chelsea said to Inter, you can't afford that, but maybe a swap deal is possible, and Inter dismissed it out of hand. And at the end of the window, a little bit later, Inter, if they're not able to offload anybody of note, will need the finances. And at that point, they're going to probably have to let go either Skriniar or Dumfries, because they want to keep hold of Bastoni and Martinez, and their finances, in fact, both Milan clubs' finances, are not in great shape at the moment. And that is also, by the way, why Milan haven't really moved and no progress has been made on Ziyech going there, because they're trying to get into Ketelaere first. And we saw with Sven Botman as well, when he went to Newcastle, Milan wanted that player, but they couldn't put together a package. So I think that with Inter, they're going to probably have to offload maybe a bit later in the window. PSG haven't yet come back with any improved offer for Skriniar, so it's quite an open race. Spurs might be lurking and could still bring in a centre-back after they've resolved a number of outgoings, and the fee is going to have to be around 70 million euros. So let's see whether Chelsea end up wanting to spend that later in the window. They haven't made a bid at this point. They're focusing on other targets. And with Dumfries again, price is a little bit of an issue. Kimpembe wants to stay at PSG, as I reported about 3 weeks ago, and he'll have the final say on any transfer. So even if a fee is agreed, and the clubs were, when they negotiated, far apart on valuation, it's all up to the player. He's very settled in Paris. He could easily extend his contract until after 2024. And dealing with PSG is tough, by the way, because Christophe Gaultier has come in, new manager, new perspective. Luis Campos is new as well. So they're able to redefine relationships with certain players comparative to Pochettino. And Gaultier really likes Kimpembe, whereas I think under Pochettino, there was maybe more chance that he would have been driven out of the club. But he's been a loyal servant to PSG, so that one at the moment is looking unlikely. And then Vardiol is a really interesting one at only 20 years of age. Leipzig's priority is to get in Werner. They don't want to let him go. Extremely problematic negotiation. I don't see that one being a straight swap deal. If it is, it will be the best piece of business that Chelsea have pulled off in this window. He's a phenomenal talent and player, only 20 years of age. But the message all summer has very much been not for sale, other than for some kind of astronomical offer. And even then, Leipzig would prefer to keep the player for another year at least, if they possibly can. So it's going to be quite hard to offer them an out-of-form Werner, even though Leipzig know him really well and are completely aware of what he can do from his time, of course, playing at the club. Yet, by the same token, I think that the necessity, because there's sort of a friction boiling between Werner and Tuchel, and he just isn't settled at all. And I think that requires, again, that particular transfer to be dealt with separately. And if you complicate that with Vardiol, then it becomes really difficult, because even if you went for Vardiol with a massive chunk of cash as a straight transfer, that would be challenging in itself. So I think that's why we're seeing Chelsea move for Cucurella and then Fofana, and that is their kind of, not in any order, but they're 1 and 2 of the 2 that they want to bring in for now. And then they'll see how far they get with Fofana and any negotiations. And if that one's shot down, they'll turn their attention back to other targets a little bit later in the window.
Yeah, no, definitely. By the way, guys, big up everyone in the chat. Almost 400 of us in here. So please do smash the likes and please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We'd really appreciate all of the support. Ben, one that's coming in the chat quite a lot is a deal for Frankie de Jong. Now, obviously, well known that Manchester United have been pursuing him. He doesn't seem keen to go there. Barca obviously owe him money as well. You spoke with Joan Laporta, the Barcelona president, I think last week or not so long ago. It's come out in The Athletic today reporting that there is kind of genuine interest from Chelsea in Frankie de Jong. What, from what you understand, what can you give us on the latest on that? And is that likely to materialise at all, do you think?
Well, I was with Joan Laporta in New York only a few days ago, and in an exclusive interview with CBS, he said very clearly that when Todd Boehly and him met for that meal, which has kind of become memes now in Barcelona, there was no discussion of de Jong. Now, what Laporta says in public and does in private are two different things. So you never quite know with Barcelona, as Chelsea have unfortunately seen all summer with Koundé is going to Chelsea and then Barcelona U-turn and make a late bid. But the reality of the situation with de Jong is that there's absolutely nothing advanced. So Thomas Tuchel likes the player. And from Boehly's perspective, if Tuchel likes a player, he becomes interested in a player. The truth is that Boehly doesn't know a great deal about de Jong or any of these targets. He's reliant on his football department and his manager. But what he is able to do is negotiate quickly and make things happen. So if Thomas Tuchel says that de Jong becomes a priority after defensive reinforcements are found, then Chelsea might move. And they're certainly monitoring the situation because, as I say, the manager actually does like the player. He also liked Dembele, though, and Chelsea didn't move. So it's one to watch. And what I do know from being out in New York with Barcelona and talking to sources is that de Jong would prefer a move to Chelsea over Manchester United. And that is obviously bad news for Erik ten Hag, because they're the ones that have painstakingly agreed a fee, the base fee of around 65 million euros plus add-ons. But there's so many moving parts here to point out, and this is why Chelsea haven't moved. So you can't, if you're Chelsea at this point, bid for de Jong and get him. That is just a fact. And the reason for that is because Barcelona are juggling 3 or 4 eventualities before a final decision is made. And it's not about what Chelsea want to do if they were to move. It's not about what Manchester United want to do, having agreed a fee. The whole transfer is down to Barcelona and their control of it. So option number 1 is that de Jong finally agrees to a, broadly speaking, 50% pay cut, and then he will stay at the football club. And Xavi actually really likes him, because even though Jules Koundé has arrived, he has the ability to play in both midfield and as a centre-back as well. And if he takes the pay cut, I think that will be the end of. And obviously, if you're going to take the pay cut, you're getting those guarantees from Barcelona that you're not going to take the pay cut and then be sold almost imminently. So taking the pay cut is as good as ending this transfer saga. That is option 1. At the moment, de Jong doesn't want to do that. Option number 2 is he continues on his long-term contract and his current wages. That's the player's preference, and to stay at Barcelona. At which point, Barca may try to drive him out because they feel that he's overpaid comparative to what they can afford. And at the same time, they need the space on their wage bill in order to register new players. And it is a balancing act because they can sign Jules Koundé, Alonso, Azpilicueta, but under La Liga's pretty strict financial regulations, they have to register these players. So they need the space on the wage bill and potentially the transfer fee as well in order to do that. So that is option number 2. And as Barcelona try and sign more players, they may tell de Jong explicitly, despite what they've said in public, you are no longer needed at this football club. And that might change the player's mentality. And then if Chelsea learn of that, that's when they could move. And then option number 3, and I think this is the crux of it, why nobody can move now and Chelsea haven't, is that deep down, Barcelona want Bernardo Silva. And when their third lever is activated, which is more money by selling a percentage of their television rights, they will try and get Bernardo Silva. And Laporta, talking to me, made that very, very clear. So then if Bernardo Silva comes in, that is further reiteration to De Jong that he's surplus to requirements. And if Silva was to come in, it's not a given before the window shuts, then I think De Jong will be even more inclined to jump ship, because suddenly he's thinking, I might be on a pay cut and I might be down the pecking order. And it's all very well saying I'm going to play centre-back, but Jules Koundé has just arrived as well. So he becomes at best a squad player on reduced wages. And at that point, he can go and play Champions League football potentially for Chelsea. So it's all in Barcelona's control. They're juggling various things before they make a final decision. The official stance is that the player is not for sale, to be taken with a pinch of salt. And then, unlike Manchester United, from Chelsea's perspective, they've not moved. They've not placed any offer. They've not shown any intent yet to make an offer. But we do know that Thomas Tuchel likes the player. So depending on how Barcelona juggle their squad and their finances and the Silva situation, it's one to watch. But what it needs to catalyse anything, if Chelsea are to move, is Barcelona to explicitly, directly, openly, honestly, candidly, because it's all games at the moment, tell De Jong they want him out and they need him out. And then if they do that, we'll see some movement. And that's where Chelsea will be watching the situation closely. And Manchester United will be hoping that De Jong changes his mind.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's definitely one to watch. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing how that might develop into the window. But I know you've got to go in a couple of minutes. I just want a very brief, quick couple of sentences on the goalkeeping situation at Chelsea. Obviously, Edouard Mendy, we know, is a number one. Kepa, World Cup year, not playing a lot. Is looking for probably a bit of a way out. Chelsea probably aren't going to recuperate the amount of money they spent for him for sure. So I guess going out on loan is going to probably help him. But Napoli, it seems like, is moving closer. Kepa seemed to disappear from the Chelsea website yesterday. I don't know if that was a mistake or he's back there or not. But Kepa loaned to Napoli, from what you understand, is that close? And does that mean that Chelsea are going to bring in another second-choice keeper? Because that leaves us with Bettinelli, who I don't really think, with the greatest respect, is not good enough. Obviously, we've agreed a deal to sign Slonina, the 18-year-old from Chicago Fire, who will be on loan until January. Do you think that Chelsea would perhaps go with just Bettinelli as a number two till January, and then when Slonina arrives, he'll just take that number two slot? Or do you envisage Kepa leaving, another number two keeper will come in? Just very briefly, because I know you've got a couple minutes.
Yeah, I think it's very possible that Chelsea look at another goalkeeper. They could even get in a loan, couldn't they, for 6 months or a season, and then phase in Slonina. Difficult for Slonina to arrive at the end of the MLS season and then become a number two, because your number two might still be playing in things like League Cups or that Champions League game where you feel like you're already through. Usually that tends to be in like the group stage when you've mathematically qualified. So that would be before his time. But you know the kind of games that I mean. And obviously at 18 years of age, and only recently 18 as well, turned 18 in May. So even by January, he'll still only be 18. It's a big, big ask to have him as the number two rather than put him in the developmental squad and the under 23s and allow him to kind of bed in. So it is a bit easier for a goalkeeper because obviously you are training and you're used to just making saves, and therefore the pace of the Premier League doesn't necessarily change from a goalkeeper's perspective compared to other positions, but the quality is obviously there and the pressure that you're put under. And with Slonina, he's always had a slight Achilles heel with coming for crosses. He's quite good at taking high balls, but when he's under pressure in the box and he has to punch, or when he has to decide whether to come off his line or not, there's a weakness there. And I think that in a Premier League game and with the movement you see in the box, especially around set pieces, that could be exposed. And the last thing anybody wants is for him to come in as a number two a season too early, play in a few games, make a few errors, and then the confidence is shot. So I would be wary about bumping him up too early to the number two. And that's why I think that it is likely that Chelsea will either go with the option that you've just outlined very neatly, or potentially still consider bringing in a goalkeeper. I'm surprised actually in many ways that a club like Chelsea haven't looked at somebody like Kasper Schmeichel. It looks like he's off to Nice and still wants to be a number one. But that's the type of goalkeeper potentially that might be tempted by a season or two at Chelsea. He'd have to be the number two, but he'd get to be part of Champions League and on pretty good way as well. So there's options out there on the goalkeeper front. And there was also that ability, if Chelsea had kind of pre-planned for the Kepa exit a little bit earlier in the window, to maybe try for a player like Zach Steffen on loan as your number 2. And the only challenge there, because he's gone to Middlesbrough, is the World Cup year. And I think this is problematic with a number 2 goalkeeper, that when you find the talent that you feel can challenge for your number 1, or at least step in if they get injured, or in a game where you choose to rotate, then usually somebody like Steffen might be up for that challenge. But because it's a World Cup year, he's thinking, I'm the number 1 goalkeeper, hopefully in competition with Matt Turner at Arsenal, who's also a number 2. Am I going to play enough games to win that race to start in the World Cup in the middle of a season? So certain targets that fall into that category, I know there's not that many, but Steffen's a good example. Would it be perfect for Chelsea as a number 2 if Manchester City were willing to let him go? But because it's a World Cup year, he drops down as he wants to play week in, week out. And I think Kasper Schmeichel, exactly the same, wants to play week in, week out, which means that he's going to be more tempted by Nice, who he's virtually agreed terms with, rather than necessarily a move to Chelsea. So let's see what they do on the goalkeeper front. No information as to targets that they might go for if they are to bring in another goalkeeper. And then, just briefly with Kepa, is pretty much agreed now that he will go on loan to Napoli. And I think that Chelsea are going to pay a large percentage of the wages as well.
No, right. I know you've got to shoot now, Ben. Thank you so much for your time. As always, really appreciate it. Fascinating insight, as always. Definitely get you back on again before the window closes. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in this afternoon. Really appreciate it. Still almost 450 of you in here. So thanks to everyone in the chat for getting involved. Thanks for your support. On your way out, please do smash the like button, and please do make sure you subscribe to the channel as well. Really appreciate all of your support. Ben, thank you very much. Guys, make sure you check Ben out on Twitter as well. Linked in the description, and you'll find him on Twitter with some great insight as always. Ben, thanks for your time. Guys, take care. Catch you again in a couple of days with a preview for the Everton game. But until then, up the Chelsea as always.